General Heth was now returning to Lexington, Kentucky, with his tail between his legs. His time in Covington, Cincinnati area was, in his opinion, pointless. Ohio was now on high alert, and Cincinnati was completely surrounded by forts and defenses that seemed impossible to penetrate. General Bragg was being pursued by Major General Don Carlos Buell's Union Army into Kentucky. So far, Bragg's plan to distract Buell from Chattanooga was working, but would it continue? The next battle would take place in Munfordville on Green River, September 14th through the 17th in 1862. Come along with us as we find out who won this battle. All aboard the Kentucky-Tennessee Living Time Machine. Please fasten your seatbelts and keep your arms and legs inside of the vehicle at all times. But to get going, we need your help. We still need to fire up that time machine to transport us. Please help us by clicking on the like, subscribe, and bell notification buttons down below. Not only does this fire up the time machine for our flight back in time, but it also convinces the YouTube algorithm that we need a bigger vehicle to reach more people who love history as much as you do. Now, back to our story. Bragg's journey to Munfordville. On August 26, 1862, Confederate General Braxton Bragg led his Army of Mississippi out of Chattanooga to march north through Sparta, Tennessee. The general and his army went further north to Glasgow, Kentucky. Through every step of the journey, Bragg was being trailed in hot pursuit by Union Major General Don Carlos Buell and his army. On September 13th, Bragg would reach Munfordville, Kentucky, and its Union garrison. With Bragg would be the following commanders: Major General William J. Hardee, Major General Leonidas Polk, Major General Simon Boulevard Buckner, Brigadier General James Ronald Chalmers, and Colonel John Scott. Altogether, these men would have the troop force of 34,000 men. The Munfordville garrison was located near a station of the Louisville and Nashville Railroad. This depot was an important part of the Union supply stations. The railroad line was also used to transport Union Army of Ohio troops in the pursuit of Bragg and could be used in attacks against Nashville and Louisville. Across the Green River was a railroad bridge that was 1,800 feet long. Since 1861, the rail bridge at Munfordville supported the Federal forces in the campaign below Nashville. The garrison there had extensive fortifications and was well defended. The garrison included Fort Craig, which was a star-shaped wood earthen fort. At the northern edge of the battlefield stood a small cemetery. There was also a stockade fort. The Union prepares for battle. On the Union side of the battle would be Colonel John T. Wilder and Colonel Cyrus L. Dunham, commanding the Army of Ohio for the Union, which had 3 regiments. This garrison at first held 1,000 troops, but later in the battle held around 4,000 men defending this area. Before the battle took place, Wilder learned that the Confederate Army had entered Kentucky. Wilder took action and strengthened his defenses around the south side of the Green River. Fort Craig defended the eastern front, and the stockade fort would defend the western front. September 13th, 1862. The first attack came from Confederate cavalry under the command of Colonel John S. Scott on September 13th. This cavalry was part of the Southern Army commanded by General Edmund Kirby Smith. They attacked the eastern fortifications at Fort Craig. Easily overrunning the position, Colonel Scott demanded the unconditional surrender of the garrison. Colonel John T. Wilder refused to surrender. Because of this refusal, Colonel Scott ordered a barrage from his horse artillery. This was brief, but the message was sent: surrender or else. Later that evening, Colonel Scott traveled south and met with General James R. Chalmers, who was at Cave City, Kentucky. The 2 men exchanged information about the garrison at Munfordville, and it was decided that without specific orders to do so, Chalmers would support Scott the next day when he once again attacked the garrison. So that night, Chalmers moved his men from Cave City to Munfordville with this purpose in mind. Again, this was all done without orders from General Bragg. It was erroneously believed by Scott that the garrison only held, quote, not more than 1,800 men, entirely raw troops, and that they were fortifying their position, but that the railroad and telegraph had been destroyed in their rear, cutting them off completely from all communication and reinforcements, unquote. September 14th, 1862. Chalmers and his men arrived early in the morning at Munfordville on September 14th. There were a few skirmishes that were started by Wilder and his men, but these were quickly quelled. Chalmers immediately demanded the surrender of the garrison. Once again, Colonel John T. Wilder stubbornly refused. Chalmers then surveyed the land and realized that the Federal defenses were in fact formidable. While Chalmers was placing his men into position for an attack, Wilder had his men burn down a church within range of his eastern defenses at Fort Craig. This action misled Chalmers into believing that the Federal forces were in retreat. Chalmers then proceeded to launch frontal attacks on the garrison, dividing his 6 regiments brigade. 3 regiments, which were supported by artillery, were sent to Fort Craig. The remaining regiments were sent to attack the stockade fort, which was near Green River. Chalmers was bringing a huge amount of pressure upon Wilder and his defenses. Federal reinforcements came from Cyrus L. Dunham's brigade. They boosted the Union forces from close to 1,800 men to 4,000 men. At that same time, Chalmers' men became bogged down trying to get through the abatis waiting for them. An abatis is sort of like a field fortification made of fallen trees and branches that were wired together to make a wall of sorts that made it impassable for an invading army. Often, the outer branches are sharpened to dissuade men from trying to climb over the abatis. Just as Chalmers' men were starting to make progress in taking the abatis, Confederate Colonel Scott's artillery accidentally fired their barrage at the backs of Chalmers' men instead of hitting the abatis or the Union troops. This friendly fire forced the troops of Chalmers to fall back, and by 9 a.m. the fighting was finished. In further humiliation, Chalmers had to ask Wilder to borrow shovels to bury the Confederate dead men. For his efforts, the garrison did not surrender, and Chalmers' brigade would suffer 288 casualties before they retreated back to Cave City. September 15th, 1862. By the morning of the 15th, Colonel John T. Wilder was relieved of his command of the garrison. Colonel Cyrus L. Dunham took command of the Federal garrison and proceeded to strengthen the defenses. Finding out what was going on, Confederate General Braxton Bragg was very angry at Chalmers. Chalmers had launched an, quote, unauthorized and injudicious, unquote, assault, in Bragg's opinion. However, Bragg also knew that if Munfordville did not surrender, it could lead to a huge loss of morale for his men. So Bragg did a forced march from his position 25 to 35 miles away to Munfordville the night of September 15th through the 16th. On his way to Munfordville, Bragg began drawing up new plans on how to attack the garrison. September 16th, 1862. In the morning hours of September 16th, General Jones M. Withers' division of the Confederate Army were heading toward the Federal defenses near the Green River Bridge. About 9 a.m. that morning, Withers and Dunham's troops began to skirmish. This skirmish ended 6 hours later at 3 p.m. At the same time, General Simon Boulevard Buckner had moved his troops around the Federal garrison and demanded its surrender. Dunham had stepped down from command of the garrison, and Colonel John T. Wilder was once again placed as the commander at that point. The Confederates knew that Buell was near and that a surrender must take place soon. They did not wish to kill or injure innocent civilians in the conflict against Buell. So once again, the Confederates sent another demand for surrender of the garrison, Fort Craig, and the stockade fort. Later that evening, under the flag of truce, Colonel Wilder entered the enemy lines while blindfolded and led to Buckner's headquarters. Confederate Major General Simon B. Buckner escorted Wilder to view the Confederate forces that he was facing. The view before Wilder was 45 cannons and over 25,000 infantry troops. Seeing that resistance was futile, Wilder agreed to the surrender of his troops. September 17, 1862, and aftermath. The formal ceremony for the surrender of the garrison at Munfordville took place. There were 4,000 prisoners, 5,000 rifles, a large quantity of ammunition, and many horses and mules that were handed over to the custody of the Confederate Army. All of the Union soldiers that had been captured at Munfordville were paroled and allowed to march south to meet up with Major General Don Carlos Buell's Army of the Ohio in Bowling Green, Kentucky. Bragg would say of the Battle of Munfordville that it was an attack that cost him 3 days of unnecessary delay. However, he would also boast that his army subdued the garrison and the railroad bridge, quote, without firing a gun, unquote. Bragg would stay 3 more days in Munfordville area after the surrender, leaving on September 20th, 1862. He would move his army toward Bardstown, Kentucky, to meet up with General Kirby Smith after he burned down the railroad bridge at Munfordville behind him. But many historians believe that Munfordville was a good example of how Bragg would react from event to event instead of planning for an overall vision for the Confederate Heartland offensive. The total estimated casualties from the 3-day battle are for the Union side 15 killed and 57 wounded and 4,133 soldiers captured. For the Confederacy that included the battle involving Chalmers were 35 killed and 253 wounded. Thank you. We at Kentucky Tennessee Living would like to thank you for watching our video series on the Appalachian Civil War battles. Don't forget to hit that like button, as the more likes we receive, the more likely YouTube is to suggest our videos to other viewers. Also, to receive notice when we upload a new video, be sure to subscribe and click the bell notification button. Be sure to double check that you are subscribed, as some of our viewers are finding that they are no longer subscribed to our channel. We thank you for continuing to support Kentucky Tennessee Living as we are discovering the mysteries in Appalachian history.